Hey community, it's Pastor Brett with today's daily Bible reading. I want to tell you about what psychologists call home blindness. This is when something is so familiar to you, you've been around it so much, you no longer see it for the details, right? Classic examples might be the pattern of tile that you have in the bathroom. Right, you go in the bathroom every day, but over time, if someone were to ask you what the tile of the pattern of the tile is, you might say, I've got no idea. Literally, like right now, I cannot think of the tile in my bathroom, but I'm there every single day. I've grown blind to it, home blind to it in my familiarity with it. It's part of the mechanism our mind uses to stop taking in all the data points around us so that we can really focus our attention. Because otherwise, if we tried to remember and retain every bit of detail we saw around us, we'd be overwhelmed. So our brain has this mechanism to kind of narrow our attention. And so I don't know what kind of tile I have in the bathroom. I don't know what the picture is that hangs in our dining room. We have a picture in the dining room. I know it was one that was painted by my mother-in-law. Love you, Myrna. But I can't picture it right now for the life of me. The details of it, what the painting is of. Home blindness. I've become so familiar with it that I stop taking in the details. Well, psychologists say this can happen in our lives, your office, your workplace, maybe some key relationships, but I also think it happens in the way we read the Bible. There are some stories, some passages that we are just so familiar with, every once in a while we need to check ourselves because we can very easily blow past it and just assume that we know exactly what is happening. We know the point. We're jumping to the conclusion, and we fail to be struck by the details. We fail to let our hearts be grabbed like they were the very first time they heard these stories. Well, today we're going to read just the ending portion of the story of the Good Samaritan. And I think for a lot of us, it's one of those stories. If you grew up in church, if you've been active recently, you've probably heard the Good Samaritan dozens of times, right? Jesus tells this story when he's asked who is his neighbor, right? He's in a conversation with a legal expert. The guy says, how do I please God? Well, he knows the answer, love God and love your neighbor. Well, who is my neighbor, he asked, trying to justify himself, right? He wanted to be able to put circles around different groups and say, these are my neighbors, these are the ones I have to love. Those are not my neighbors. Those are not the people I am commanded by Scripture to love. And so Jesus tells him this story. And it's of a Samaritan man. And a Samaritan is the hero of this story, which is radical in that day because Jews and Samaritans did not get along. Jews did not tell stories in which the Samaritans were the heroes. It was a trope. It was known that the Samaritan was always the bad guy. Like I grew up in the 80s, and if there was a Russian in a movie, you knew you couldn't trust the guy, right? You knew that with that little accent, he was going to end up being a bad guy. Well, it was like that in the way that Jews told stories in the first century. The Samaritans were never the good guys. They were never the heroes, especially if it meant that another Jewish person was put in a bad light. That's exactly how Jesus tells this story. A man is beat up, left for dead on the road, and religious Jews pass by him. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they're distracted by their religious duties. Maybe they're afraid to defile themselves. We don't know, but we know they don't act. They don't show mercy. They don't intervene. And they just pass by this dying man. And then a Samaritan comes. And the Samaritan not only stops and makes time in his day, finds margin to reach down and to bother himself with this man's problems. He actually puts this beaten up, left for broke, left for dead man on his donkey and takes him to the nearest inn. And not only that, does he put him up in a room, he tells the innkeeper, like, whatever he needs, you get for him and you charge it to me. At the end of the story, we read these verses, today's verses, Luke 10, verses 36 and 37. Jesus speaks here. Which of these three, Jesus is asking the legal expert, do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Jesus flips this question. Remember, the story began with the question, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus flips it on the legal expert and says, who are you willing to be neighborly towards? Who are you willing to be a neighbor to? Because when we draw those lines, when we circle one group and say, they're my neighbors, and this other group is not my neighbors, whether that's because of geography, that's because of skin color, that's because of religious background, that's because of culture, language. As soon as we exclude someone from being our neighbor, being someone that is worthy of our love and mercy, Jesus said, no, now you're out of the will of God. Now you're no longer willing to love your neighbor as yourself, as God has taught us. So instead of asking, well, who's my neighbor? Who's in and who's out? Jesus said, look in your own heart and says, who are you willing to be neighborly towards? And how does the legal expert answer? He can't even say the Samaritan, right? He can't mouth those words. He says, the one who showed mercy. Mercy is such a powerful, impactful idea when we look at it. Because mercy asks us to do something. It asks us to sacrifice a little bit. It asks us to step into someone else's pain or someone else's problem, someone else's situation for the day and to act. Mercy is active. I think sometimes about the difference between the word empathy and apathy, right? At the core of both of those words is this Greek word pathos, right? It can literally mean to suffer. That we say a pathology today is something that someone is suffering from. Empathy is to step into someone's suffering, to suffer with them, and to journey with them through their suffering, where apathy is to say, I'm not going to be bothered by their pathos, by their suffering. It's apathos, apathy. I'm not going to join them in their suffering. They are on their own. That's what we see happening here in this story. The Samaritan man showed empathy. He joined the man in his suffering. He, in a small way, took on some suffering himself by being inconvenienced, paying money, making sacrifices to make sure he was cared for, while the other men were apathetic. They couldn't be bothered by his suffering. They would not join in his suffering. See, mercy is so powerful because ultimately, if you are a follower of Jesus, the reason that we give mercy to others, the reason that we're willing to step into their suffering and journey with them through it is not because they deserve it, not because they've got it all together, not because we're even, placing a bet on them. We think that we believe in them, they're going to get it figured out. We do it because that's what God has done for us. That's what God has given us in Jesus. And we take that same mercy, that same grace, that same love, and we give it out freely. Let God sort it out from there. The one who had mercy, the legal expert answered. And Jesus' answer is so powerful and so convicting and so perfect for what we need to hear today. Jesus simply said, go and do likewise. Community, this week, today, go and do likewise. God bless.